Hail thee well, and welcome all. I'm the Jake of all trades, and on this episode of the Dungeon Master Masterclass, I'm going to be talking to you about stat cards. As I was writing up the outline and thinking about this video some more, I realized that there are quite a few uses for note cards that, aside from stat cards for monsters and stuff, and so I'm going to be telling you about all of the different uses you can be using these for. Well, maybe not all of them, but a lot of the ones that you could be using it for that maybe you hadn't thought of before. And although the majority of this content is for Game Masters, there is quite a bit of information that could be useful to players as well. But this is the Dungeon Master Masterclass, and so I'm going to save that player information until after I have finished the Game Master side of things. Then we can talk about you guys and how you can be incorporating stat cards with your characters. Feel free to watch along, though, because there's going to be lots of interesting information, and maybe if your Game Master isn't using some of these methods, you can suggest some of them to him, and maybe him or her, and they can start maybe trying to use some of this stuff. And it's also just pretty interesting, so, and your part is pretty short, so I want you to feel like you're getting the full episode too, so feel free to listen along, players. So before we get into things, I have a few small suggestions for you Game Masters. The first thing is I want you to be experimenting early on with these versions of your stat blocks and stuff. If you don't like mine, change it. There's a good chance that you might want to put some of those stats preferenced over the other ones, you know, or put some of the other ones in different positions, you know, and whatever is going to be easiest for you. So be sure that you experiment and be sure that you do it early, because I want you to also stay consistent while you're doing this. That's something that will really help you along the way. You'll be able to look back at your old stat cards, and you'll be able to find all of the information you need if you maintain a consistent layout when you're creating these. My layouts have subtly shifted as I've been doing these over a year or so, and I've expanded some information and reduced others, and so it's kind of, you know, my preference for what information that I want about that creature or monster or whatever. So be sure that you experiment and find your own style, and also be sure that you try to stay consistent once you find your style. Maybe go back on your old blocks that you know are different and try to rewrite those so that they match your current ones. That'll make it much easier for you when you're referring back to these in later sessions. Perhaps years go by before you look at these cards. So that can be very beneficial. Alright, let's get into it then. So first use we have for the stat cards is, of course, for monster or NPC stats. And I'm going to be showing a few examples over on the left side of the screen as well, so that you can see what I mean when I say monster or NPC. Of course, it's just like your typical wandering monster, or a monster that you have set up in a dungeon or for an encounter, or an NPC that you have set up for an encounter, or anything like that. You can use these stat cards pretty quickly to find whichever information, whatever information you need, and then pull it out so that you have it at hand. And it's like a compressed character sheet. That's my basic outline for my stat block. I try to maintain the same sort of outline of a character sheet, and that helps me when I am playing it, because I'm used to looking at a character sheet when I'm referring to skills and stats and stuff. So that's what I used personally. I liked that. It was just easier for me. They're also really good, as I mentioned, for NPCs. Those don't have to just be foes, though. Those could also be friendly NPCs, especially if they're NPCs who are going to be traveling with the party a lot. It can be incredibly useful to have their information handy, because you know, even if they're not a combatant, even if they're just hanging out on the sidelines, they're still potentially, you know, they could still get hit by like a stray arrow or something, or one of the monsters could go for them instead of the rest of the party. That's still a possibility. So it's good for that kind of information as well to have on hand. So you can also use it for people who aren't adventuring with the party. You could also use it for just NPCs in cities and villages and stuff, the ones that the characters go back to a lot, or especially if they don't visit it a lot, it could also be useful, because then if you don't remember it because they never visited, it's been like, oh man, it's been like 7 months since they went to that one shop. But you still want to have that information on hand, and you want to still maintain some verisimilitude, right? You want to keep your players engaged, and you want them to believe that this is like an actual world that they are interacting with, and that even if they haven't been back in 7 months and they don't remember what this guy is like, you can still present the same character, and then immediately your players will catch on and be like, oh man, I remember this guy now. So if you want to do that, it's pretty easy. You can just write the name at the top of the note card over there, and you can give like a small description of the person, maybe their personal description, like their size, stature, clothing, stuff like that, how they speak, that sort of thing, stuff that's going to help you when you are presenting them to the characters. And you can also give some descriptions about their local environment, like what does their shop look like, or what does their keep look like, or whatever, their village, their farm, that sort of thing. And a quick way for referencing, if you do want to do this, you can just kind of like write the address on the back of the note card, the blank side of the note card, and then you just write it like you would like a letter or something that you were mailing out. But I would start with like the large portion, like start with your kingdom, and then your country, and then your city or whatever, and then get down to like the specific name of the shop, perhaps, or the name of the business or enterprise or whatever they're doing that they work at, or whatever they're associated with as the bottom line. And that way you can kind of work your way down and figure out exactly where it's at. It makes it easier for reference if you can store all of your like kingdoms together with all of the countries and cities and stuff, if that is something you want to do. That is an option. I've never done that personally, but I thought of it while I was writing up this video, and I thought, hey, that could be a nifty way to keep track of NPCs, especially if you're creating NPCs on the fly like I am most of the time. I just want to quickly go over my layout for these stat cards. You can see in the top left corner I have the name of the creature, and next to that I have the CR and the XP for defeating that creature. Below that I have its basic ability blocks: Strength, Dex, Con, Int, Wiz, Cha, and I have written their actual scores and then the modifiers for those scores. I find it can be handy to know the actual scores when it comes to specific abilities and stuff like that. It can be handy to know exactly what their scores are, especially if the characters are doing using abilities that drain those abilities. It can be handy to know what the actual scores are as opposed to the modifiers. Below that, you can see that I have the forts, reflex, will saves, all of the saves blocks, and then the AC block as well: touch AC, flat-footed, and standard AC. And below those, we have the base attack bonus, the initiative, the CMB, the CMD, the attack. Those are your combat stats, basically. And you can see with the attack, I've written the modified totals for those attack modifiers. With this example, Bugbear, it has a Morningstar, a +5, Javelin, +3. Those are with its base attack bonus and its modifiers added into those already. I don't think it's necessary to separate those at all. I think it works fine just the way it is. At the top again, we'll go back to the top, the right-hand side now. You can see that there's the alignment, chaotic neutral. There's the hit points, which I have written the average, and then I've written the dice totals for that average. If you wanted to, like, this is handy if you wanted to make like a boss Bugbear, but you didn't want to really pimp out its stats, you could just max out its hit points and maybe give it one more AC or something like that to make it a boss or a commander. Maybe a lieutenant might be a better term. But yeah, that's why I have those hit dice up there. Then you can max it out. Instead of being 16, if you maxed it out, it would be 27, and that makes it a much more formidable opponent, especially if you've increased the AC. Below that, I have the special abilities, and those are just its special qualities, its race abilities, its monster abilities, whatever kind of things that the block says that it has wherever you're finding your information. You can see that I also included the feats in there: the intimidating prowess, skill, focus, perception. You can underline feats if you want to, but I underline a lot of other things like auras and constant effects and things like that, and so it can get confusing if you underline everything. I find it's easier just to remember which ones are feats. Like, I know that skill, focus is a feat, I know intimidating prowess is a feat, and so I know those are feats when I read them. And below that, you can see that I have the languages as well, what languages the creature speaks fluently. I may also write, maybe it speaks it, but it doesn't, or it understands it, but it doesn't speak it, or maybe I write that it speaks it, but it doesn't write it, or something like that. On the far right-hand side, you can see finally we have the size and the speed of the creature. The size is kind of lumped in with the creature type. Below the alignment and hit points, you can see it says medium humanoid goblinoid, and then under size I have medium again. That is something I've refined my style, and I've excluded writing medium under the creature description and including it under size instead. So that gives me more space to write the creature type, and that way I don't have it as crammed as it is on this one here. You can see goblinoid creeps right up on speed there. And then there's the speed. If it has a flying speed or a burrowing or a climbing speed, you can include that below it. You can just write fly 50 feet good, or 60 feet average, or whatever, climb 30 feet, something like that. And then, of course, below that we have the skills. And like I said, I set this up to look like a character sheet, and that is why the skills are on the far right. That's why all the ability blocks are in the top left, and all of the basic creature statistics are at the very top, and that sort of thing. I wanted to look like kind of like a character sheet and read like a character sheet. That made it easier for me to read these stats and to interpret them and to play this character real time, engaging with the players, that sort of thing. So you can see that it has the skills there, and yeah, this is what my stat blocks looks like. This is my basic block. This is pretty much what all of my stat cards look like. You'll be seeing some examples further on in the video and you'll see how this corresponds to those examples as well. But you can see this is all the basic information. I haven't included some things like organization and environment and social structure and stuff like that. It's just too much information. You can write that stuff on the back of the note card if you want to, but a lot of the time I find that if I'm using those note cards and like holding them up and using them, I stand a lot when I'm GMing, and then I'm fearful that my players will see information on the back that I don't want them to see, and that's why I don't typically do that, though I have in the past. Alright, the next use for stat cards that we have, or note cards, I should say, that we have is for special items, or unique items, or, anything that you want to give. Maybe a cursed item that you want to give to your players. Any kind of a special or unique item. You can use a note card to write up the stats for that and present it to your players. It's a nifty way for them to keep their weapon, their special weapon, on hand so that they always know about it. If they always see it on the corner of their character sheet, they're going to be more inclined to remember it, even if it's something that they aren't using because they're not proficient with it, or for whatever reason it's too large or small or something. But it's very easy. You can write the name and the stats at the very top of the card or on the first couple lines, and then you can give a cool description of the weapon below. Maybe what it does when it makes contact with an enemy, or what it does on a critical hit. If it makes, maybe nothing mechanically is different, but you can do some cool aesthetic stuff so that your players think that it's just a really sweet weapon. Maybe on a critical hit it does like a not additional fire damage, but whatever the target is like wreathed in flames for a moment. Its flames just kind of like swirl over its body, and that's what causes the fire damage, or something like that. Maybe it gives off a subtle glow when it is around goblins or orcs, like Sting does, something like that. To engage your players. And hey, if you're feeling really ambitious, or if you really want to treat your players, you can draw a picture of that weapon on the back of the stat card. If you look in the player's handbook and the Dungeons Master Guide and all of those books and stuff, you'll see that for all of the unique and enchanted magical weapons and stuff, they typically have fun illustrations, like fun things like that correspond with the characteristics of its features. So that's something that you can think about, especially if you are creating your own custom items, which is something that we might talk about in a later video. But I would really recommend this if you're going to be handing out those kinds of items to your players. Maybe if you have new players who aren't used to that, remembering all of the equipment that they have, that can be a really good, useful tool for them. And it's also really great at engaging your players, if that is your trouble around your table. You can really help to draw your players in if they can see that cool artwork, and it just it helps them. It helps fill in the gaps for them, and it makes it a little bit easier for them to play within this world, if that makes any sense at all. Alright, moving right along, now we come to curses, diseases, or other status effects that your players might obtain. This is something that's kind of fun. It's one that I just recently thought of as I was like rereading through the player's handbook and stuff. I was noticing the thing on the section on curses and diseases and stuff near the back of the book, where they talk about a few of the sample ones and maybe how to create some of your own if you wanted to, that sort of thing. And I just recently, my players in my new campaign were recently cursed with lycanthropy, and that became a thing that they had to deal with in one way or another. And it was really, I thought it might be handy. Like, hey, they just got cursed with lycanthropy. I should write up a stat card for a lycanthropy curse. And that way, if I ever come across it again, or I ever need to reference it again, maybe for the sake of an NPC, or for a story or something like that, I have that information quick at hand. I also did my own little twist on lycanthropy, or my own little thing. I wanted to make sure it was kind of my own thing and unique, and I wanted it to really feel like lycanthropy as I believed it to work. If you know how that is. If you're watching this, you probably are a game master who has twisted the game a little bit to meet your needs. So that's kind of what I did in that situation. And it can be really good for that. Or it can just be good for writing down the base curses and stuff. It can be really fun if you just writing that information down a lot of the times is enough to just get you thinking about it. And then you will, before you know it, be implementing it within your game. You'll be finding reasons to give your players mummy rot, or to poison them with dragon's bile, or some nonsense like that. And it can be really nifty and handy to have this information on hand if that is something that you want to incorporate into your game more. But something I'm thinking about incorporating in my game more. So, if you do that, what I would suggest is maybe color coding your cards. They have sets of colored index cards, I'm sure you're aware, and you can just use some of like the easier shades, like the light green, yellow, the light red ones, maybe the pinkish kind of ones, to write the curses on. I've seen purple ones, and I don't really like those, and I don't really like the dark green ones. Those can be difficult to see the writing on, especially, so that's my major concern, but maybe it's not a problem for you, and you don't really care. But anyway, I would suggest using some color coding, and that might help you. Maybe curses are yellow, and diseases are green, and then poisons are red, or something like that, perhaps. That's up to you, but that's how I would do it. And hey, you want to be really crafty and stuff, you can flip that card over, and maybe you can write the cures on the back of that card, or if you have space, on the bottom of the card. I thought about writing it on the back of the card, and that way if my players were investigating the disease, if they didn't roll high enough, then I could just show them the front half of the card and be like, this is what you know, this is what it does, the negative stuff. And they're like, what about a cure? I'm like, oh, you didn't roll high enough for the cure, so you don't get to see the cure, which is, just on the other side of this card. So, that's for you to know. and to give to them at some other point, because hopefully they're not going to stay afflicted forever. That would be terrible. So, the next use I have for stat cards, or note cards, I keep saying stat cards. Note cards, I'm writing stats on all of the cards, so maybe stat cards is still work. But anyway, my next use is for environmental effects, or hazards, or specifically disasters. That is what I have used them for in the past. The first thing I used them for was for lava, primarily. I wrote the stats for lava, what it does when you touch it, what it does when it engulfs you, that sort of thing, the damage specifically, because that's important. And then I also tried to just kind of write out my own little speeds for the lava, based on what kind of incline it was rolling down. And that way, if I ever had to reference back to lava for any reason, for like a spell, or for a mechanic, or a volcano, or anything like that, I could be like, oh, how steep is the incline? And then it moves this fast, this many squares per round, this many feet per round, that sort of thing. I also wrote up, after I did the lava, I thought, hey, this is cool, I could write up a few others for this. And so I wrote up one for a blizzard, which included like the speed and the size and the effects for it and the damage. And I didn't have to write this up. This information is provided in most game systems. Whatever game system you're playing, if blizzard is a thing that can happen in the game, like from a spell, then typically there's going to be statistics for that spell or that natural occurrence, that phenomenon, that disaster. So, but I wrote up the speed of it, the size and its effects, basically, based on a few circumstances, and then the damage that it would do, and the sort of, the rough terrain and all that stuff, and cold that they've had to make fortitude saves against, that sort of thing. I also realized that, hey, you know what, the blizzard is pretty similar to a haboob, and I wrote up a haboob stat card as well. A haboob, if you are not aware, it's a dust storm essentially, but it's like a giant dust storm. It's like one of those dust storms that, is blowing dust like hundreds, or like, maybe not hundreds, but like dozens of kilometers or miles an hour, and it is like hundreds of kilometers long sometimes. These things are like really, really nasty, like scary desert storms. And I was like, hey, that's a fun environmental hazard that the players might have to deal with. And so I wrote up some statistics for a haboob. What's the airspeed like? If they're flying, that's going to really hamper their movement, especially if they're being, pelted with all of this sand that's preventing them from seeing what they're doing and all that stuff. And there's probably going to be a little bit of damage too, because that sand, it's like sand blasting them essentially. Like when sand is like that quantified, like that thick, that dense and is being hurled at those kinds of speeds, that stuff can, like, you know, cut like flesh from the bone, that sort of thing. It can wear the bone to dust over time, and so it can be pretty gnarly, and it's something that's a force to reckon. But those are the only ones that I've actually written up stat cards for, but I'm going to be writing up a few more eventually when I get around to it. I have lots of stat cards I want to make. A few of the other ones that I thought of while I was writing this up, you could do a stat card for quicksand. How difficult is it to get out of? What's the reflex save to avoid it? You know, how do you climb out of it? What's the climb check to get out of it? And how fast does it consume you? I mean, if you're typically in the real world we think of quicksand as being not incredibly dangerous, but of course because of like movie legends and stuff like that, you know, everybody, you know, when you first think of quicksand, the first thing you think of is inescapable death. And then the second thing you think of is like, oh, it's like soupy sand, and it's actually not that dangerous. I mean, you will never sink below your medium, essentially, because it's sandy water. It's so dense. It's kind of like if you were in like the Dead Sea, you can essentially just float on that stuff. So it's not really a hazard at all. It's just like really goopy. But I like to think of quicksand as more of a dangerous thing and more of like an actual environmental hazard. And so you could write up stats for a quicksand. How fast does it consume you? How quickly do you need to get out of it before it envelops you whole? There's an earthquake. What kind of damage would an earthquake do to structures and stuff like that? What kind of damage might it do to the players if they were caught in an urban environment with lots of structures that might be crumbling around them? That's stuff to think about, the kind of crushing damage that it might do to them, and other environmental effects an earthquake might cause. And then the last one I thought of was a tsunami or something like that, just like a huge a wave of water that comes in, and you know, how large is that tsunami? How tall is it? How wide is it? What kind of damage does it do? How high does it raise the water level? How far does the water level recede before it comes in those final seconds before it actually hits the shore? Those are some things you could write on your tsunami stat card. One I just thought of right now, you could do a tornado also. What kind of wind speeds are you looking at? What's like the funnel shape and diameter, and what kind of checks do you need to make to resist it if it is nearby and trying to suck you into its, you know, vortex of death? Those are some things that you could write out for your environmental hazard stat cards. And finally, the last GM use I have for stat cards is that you can just use it for a script, essentially. You can use it as a NPC dialogue script. If there is something very specific that you want to say to your players, that's what you can use one of these index cards for. I should not call it a stat card in this instance, because it's just an index card. No stats, just talk. Alright, so you don't want to be using this often, probably, but occasionally you may have an instance where you are like, hey, I have some very specific information that I need to give to my players, and I want to be sure that I don't forget anything. And in those instances, you may want to pull out one of your blank stat cards and use it for some dialogue. If you are going to do this, there's a few things I might mention. If it's going to be just a short bit of dialogue, like one paragraph or less, like a couple words, you know, a couple sentences, that sort of thing, just write it all out. You'll have plenty of space, and it shouldn't be too difficult. If you write big, it shouldn't be too difficult for you to read word for word while you are still maintaining eye contact with your players. That's the important thing about reading dialogue at any point in the game, is that you need to be sure that you are not reading it so much as speaking it. That's kind of your job as the game master. One of your many jobs is actor, and an actor recites his lines, he presents them, he does not read them off of a script. Not when he's performing, and you are always performing as a game master. So, if it's short, you can write it out, write it big so that it's easy to see, and make sure that you practice it a lot so that it's easier for you to speak in whole to your players. If it's longer than that, if it's like a longer sort of list of things or a bullet point, or you want to make like maybe just like a heroic speech or something like that an NPC is giving to a member of soldiers or something, the party included, you want to write out this heroic, like Henry VIII or something, you know, speech. And to do that, you want to write out a short outline probably. And you don't want to make it too long, obviously. Anytime you're doing these NPC monologues, you want to keep it kind of brief, because the spotlight should always stay focused on the players. And so if you're doing this, keep it short. But a few paragraphs, you should be able to outline down to a few lines of text that you can quickly reference back to. And again, you need to practice this over and over and over again. Probably more than for the shorter stuff, but that's, that goes with the territory. More words, more practice. So be sure that you practice if you are ever going to try doing this. But as long as you practice, go ahead. I've done this method many times for my NPC dialogue. If I don't have space on the notes and I realize that, oh man, the NPCs need to communicate some information to them, or there's a specific encounter that one of the players is dealing with. While my party of Avatar players was on the island of Nanzu, there was one player who had one encounter in the jailhouse that required quite a bit of dialogue from me, and I had to make sure that I had it all handy, and so I used a couple index cards to write all of that dialogue out for. I didn't really need hardly any of it, as it happened, but I'm glad that I had it, in case that I did need it. So, go ahead and use it for dialogue. Make sure that you practice, and make sure that you keep it short, no matter how much you're doing. Keep it, not too long, because, again, the focus should be on your players. They're the ones who really need to shine in this, and you don't want to... Anytime that an NPC is talking too long, people start getting bored. So you want to make sure that you minimize that time, and, keep it short and sweet, as the golden rule that you should follow. Okay, we've talked about the uses for the cards. Now we should talk about how you are going to go about storing them. And this is something that I have don't have a whole lot of experience in, actually. I haven't actually done a whole lot of storing my note cards. I do have quite a few, but that's beside the point. Here are some of the options that I looked into, though. You could do like the simple Rolodex index cards, and these are more like business or address card sort of things. I'm going to be showing a picture over there so you get an idea of what I'm talking about, and those can be pretty nice, especially if you're like a stay-at-home GM. Those will sit on your table or your desk very nicely, I would think, and they have the little alphabet things so you can like scroll through and find the right, if you alphabetize all your monsters and stuff. And they should sell like packs of cards for those as well that you can like add into it and make it bigger if you wanted to, expand it, maybe you get a couple of them over time if you have that many stat cards. That's something you could think about. One of the drawbacks is that those cards are much smaller than the traditional 3x5 index cards. Those cards are 2 5/8 inches by 4 inches, standard typically. The old Rolodex cards, I think, were 3x5, but apparently those are hard to come by now. I saw a lot of people selling the cards online. I did not find a lot of people selling the actual Rolodexes online, so I don't really know what those look like. A few of the other options you have, there's like a card box that you could also buy. These are pretty, pretty ordinary, not very flashy, not nearly as flashy as like a Rolodex or anything like that. It's just typically like a blank plastic box of varying colors that holds so many index cards. And I think you can probably buy them and find them in varying sizes. I found one that was like 300 that looks kind of nice. It was just like a plain plastic, probably like a little kid would use in school, like a snap, sort of locking thing. But then I also saw a nicer one that was like a large, long metal case with like with a plastic cylinder, like a lid on top. And that one looked like it held quite a few more, and it had a metal structure, so it looked like it could also take more of a beating probably. But yeah, so those are some of the card boxes that you could look at. Now, as I said, they're not nearly as flashy, and they're not as cool. A little harder maybe to flip through and to prioritize what information you might need. And but they are much more portable than the Rolodex ones. The Rolodex looked to me like they would be very difficult to try to throw in your bag or toss in your car without risking stuff going everywhere. And I thought that would be good for the stay-at-home GM, whereas these boxes, these card boxes, it's the closed shut. Those might be better if you are traveling to a different location for your game every night, as I typically am. So, something to consider. It makes a difference. Are you playing at home? Are you going somewhere? That might influence what you want to buy to store your cards. The last method I have for storing your cards, though, is by far the cheapest, the easiest, and the quickest to store your cards. And this is the one that I have primarily been using to store my cards. I've been storing them with, I just bundle them up and I rubber band them together. That's all I do. yeah, see here, I just have some stat cards, as you can see maybe. My light's not too bright. Some varying stats here, and yeah, I just bundle them up with the rubber band here, and then I stick them in a folder in my little DM book, my screen thing, my portfolio, and that's how I've been doing it. It's super fast, super easy, incredibly cheap. It's just like, man, it's just like the easiest thing you can possibly do, pretty much. And the one thing that I have noticed, though, is that you don't want to do this if you only have a few stat cards, because if small bundles tend to like bend and get worn very, very quickly, it works much better if you can get like a large, thick stack of these things and then like rubber band them together. And then they all kind of protect each other a little bit more, and it's a little safer to just toss in your bag if you're traveling about, or if you're just tossing them in a drawer in between sessions. It's a good way to just keep them all together, and so that way you don't have to worry about them. Again, not very flashy, but super, super utile, super easy. I mean, everyone's got rubber bands, right? Super easy to just rubber band those things together and toss them in a drawer until you need them. So, rubber band method. There is one other method I forgot to mention. I found this while I was looking for one of the card boxes. I was looking for a card box so I could buy one and show it to you guys, but I didn't find one at my local CVS. Instead, I found this thing, which is a small notebook of 50 index cards. And you can see that it's wire bound there at the top. It's caliber, which is, you know, decent note cards. And I'm going to use this. I'm going to just fill out all the stat cards, and then I'm going to just keep them in here so that I have them handy all the time. There's a few examples here. Here's a Chon-Chon, which is a monster I discovered earlier. There's a Clawbat. There's a Mongrel Man, and things like that. You know, it's just you can put all kinds of stuff in here, and then I put a little index list at the top there where you can see kind of what creatures are available and what CRs they are. Sorry, I'm still getting used to the camera there. And it kind of gives you, and that way I'm going to write in some page numbers and then write in the page numbers, and that way when I fill it up, I will be able to quickly flip through it, kind of like my own little monster manual, essentially. That's the thing that I really like about using these for stat cards, is that you can essentially create your own monster manuals. In fact, give me just another moment here. I believe I have it right down here in this drawer. I did use stat cards to create my own monster manual. This is actually like a whole role-playing book, but the back half of the book, once I had finished writing up all the rules and stuff, I found I had enough space to dedicate to a monster manual, a bestiary of sorts, is what I decided to call it. And this is for my Avatar game, and there's a few different creatures. You can see that each of these has each page has a note card in there, and with like a name and stuff on the top. What you'll notice is when I try to pull these out of here, if I can get one out of here, I'll pull a few out. I did that. I drew illustrations on the page with under the stat cards, essentially. And that way, when I handed the book to my players, and I was like, hey, this is, wait for the screen to go back to normal there. This is your bestiary. And these stat cards are all the monsters in there. And whenever they encounter a specific monster, one of the players who had the bestiary on his character, he would be like, I open my book, what do I find? And I'm like, roll a search check or a perception check to, you know, quickly find this. And he rolls his check, and then I would like open the book, or a lot of times I would already have pulled out the stat card, and I would have it in my notes already. And then I would just hand him the book, and then be like, all right, what do you find? And then I would hand it to him, and he would flip through it until he found one of the pages where the stat card was missing, and that would draw his eye to the page and be like, oh, I'm dealing with a Komodo rhinoceros. I know that it has a thick hide, which is like gives it a large AC probably. It's protection for its large body. Powerful charge, does a bunch of damage, that sort of thing. It's pretty gnarly. So that's the kind of information I would present to them, and that's the kind of information they could get if they rolled high enough. And that's one of the ways you can use these, and that's kind of like a realistic version of like a bestiary. Also, you know, if you just have the regular stats, that works too. That's kind of like a bestiary as well. That's how I'm gonna do my notebook, actually. I decided it might be interesting if I wrote the description for the character at the top of the notes here. You can kind of see there's a little bit of text at the top and above the stats on the back side of the card in front of it. I just wrote some stuff up there, but then when that's for me to see back here. Once I'm done reading it, I can flip it down, and then there's a little illustration for the players so that they can kind of get an idea of what they're up against as well. And I've written all the text upside down so that they don't have a chance of reading it unless they're like really, you know, I'll probably be able to notice if they are. And I also have some other information. I wrote the environmental information, the organization, and the treasure. That's information that I wanted for the characters, or the creatures, but I couldn't include on the first page because I didn't have the space required. As you can see, I've kind of filled that sucker up. I didn't have a whole lot of room. So I just included that information up here instead, right at the bottom of there of that top card. Oops. Alright, there we go. So yeah, it's like a bestiary, and that's another way that you can store your note cards. Okay, players, you've been pretty patient as far as I'm concerned. It's been quite a while, and you have earned your uses for the stat cards if you didn't just skip ahead. But there's no way I can control it, so here you are anyway. So, first thing, special items again. If you were watching before, the GMs, you can use these for special items to award to their players, but maybe your GM hasn't given you a special stat card for an item that you were like, hey, that's kind of a sweet item, and I would really like a stat card for that. Well, why don't you go ahead and just make your own then? You can go back to that part of the video and listen back to it and just make your own stat card for your special item based on the stuff that your GM has given you. And if you have one of those cool aesthetic effects that doesn't really mechanically increase the damage or change anything, but aesthetically it creates like a new sort of thing, then that's something you could run by your game master and be like, hey, is it okay if I incorporate this with my weapon since it's like this, you know, it does like cold damage or something like that? Can I have it sound like ice is shattering if I get like a critical hit or something? And, you know, stuff like that. You know, just add a little flavor to it and make it your own, that sort of thing. And a stat card can really help you if you find yourself forgetting a weapon a lot of the time. Drop one of these little special item cards for it, and then just paperclip it to the top of your character sheet so that you can always see it. And especially if you put a little color on that thing, it'll pop out and you'll be able to notice it more often. Those will be my suggestions for it. As a player, if you're having a hard time keeping track of your spells, you could also write up some spells on index cards. And in fact, one of these little wire-bound notebooks would probably work pretty well for that. You could just write a different spell on each note card, and then you would always be able to know, you know, what spells did what. You could write the exact effects of each spell, and that way you didn't have to flip through the entire spell section of the player's handbook every time you needed to reference the specifics of a single spell. It makes it even easier than writing down page numbers well, that's what I would typically do, is write a page number next to my spell, and that way it was easier for me to find. But even then, I had to, you know, grab the player's handbook and flip it open and find that page, find that spell on that page, and then read through the specifics of that spell. It's much quicker if you have your spell book on hand, and then you can just pull that sucker out, and you know many fewer spells than are in the player's handbook. It'll be much easier for you to quickly flip until you find the right spell and use it for that purpose. Another possible use for these stat cards is, again, one of the GM uses, and you probably don't want to hear this, players, but curses, diseases, and other status effects. Stat cards can be incredibly useful for that. If you contract lycanthropy, like I mentioned earlier, my players contracting lycanthropy, it might be kind of nice if your game master were to hand you a copy of that lycanthropy card. If you succeed on the prerequisite checks so that you are able to know that information at the least. You know, maybe he hands you your own copy, and that way you are able to keep track of it. And this kind of works like the special items before. You know, you can paperclip it at the top of your character sheet, and that way you can always be thinking about it during your session. And if you're anything like me or my players, you are more into the role-playing side of things, and that can be really beneficial for the role-playing purposes. If you have that curse always sitting up there reminding you of your curse, then you can role-play with that. You can work it into your character, the way your character presents him or herself to others, or the things that other people notice about your character, that sort of thing. You could mention it to your game master if you were really into it, and be like, hey, would they notice anything about me being like a werewolf, or it being really close to a full moon or something like that? Like in Skyrim, you know how a lot of the random villagers or guards and stuff will mention that you're not looking so well if you've contracted some sort of disease, and that's your clue that, oh crap, I contracted a disease and I didn't notice it because I was fighting something, and now I have to go get that rock joint cured or whatever. That can be a nifty way, you know, that way you don't forget about your disease. It's always there reminding you, and that way you remember to deal with it perhaps, because that's how your character would feel if they were afflicted with a disease like this. That is something that they would physically be able to feel. You can't, because you're a player. You're just representing them. You need a little help, and that's okay. We all need a little help, and this is one of those things that you can use to help you. So even if you don't want to be cursed or be infected with a disease, if you are, these can help you with your role-playing, and they can help you maybe with getting a cure, remembering that you have it, remembering what deadlines you have, and that's working within those limits, that sort of thing. Maybe your cure information is also on there if you have a benevolent game master, and so you can work off of that as well. The next player use for these stat cards is very similar to a monster block or an NPC block. In fact, it is an NPC block. It's an NPC block for your animal companion. If you are a ranger or a druid or otherwise have an animal companion for whatever reason, a stat card can be a good way to keep track of those stats. And again, if you paperclip it with your character sheet and it's up there, and you don't have too many of these stat cards at the top of your character sheet by now, you will be paying attention to that, and you will be able to remember that you have an animal companion. That is the one thing that I dislike most about my players having animal companions, is that they always forget about the animal companions until it's convenient for them to be there, and then all of a sudden the animal companion has been there the whole time, and it's like, well, what about when you guys swam to this underwater temple? Was your eagle swimming with you to that underwater temple? And they have to take a moment to stop and think about the circumstances and realize that no, their eagle probably wouldn't be with them. And this is something you have to think about. If you always have that little stat card at the top of your character sheet when you're making checks and stuff, you're going to be seeing that up there, and you're going to be, maybe, hopefully, you will be remembering that you have an animal companion that you have to consider, and perhaps you will also remember that you have an animal companion who can possibly aid you. That's the other thing. There's been a lot of situations that my players have been in where if they had used their falcon or their hog monkey or something, they might have actually been able to do something that would have been outside the player's ability normally, and that's something they didn't really think about because they had forgotten that they had those animal companions. So, use it for animal companions. If you don't already have a character sheet, that is. That's totally an acceptable option as well. If you have printed off a separate character sheet, or specifically an animal companion sheet for your animal companion, that works too. That's great. That serves the exact same purpose. But if you do not have either one of these yet, I would highly recommend that you just draw up a little stat block for your animal companion really quick. I feel like it'll really help improve your role-playing experience. And finally, the last player use I have for stat blocks is possibly for a hired NPC, like specifically a non-player character that your party has hired for whatever reason. And you are probably not going to have to worry about this for quite a while. People don't typically hire NPCs until they get up there in levels. Typically, you're going to be hiring someone who's a few levels lower than you. That's sort of how it works. And typically, they're not in a combat role. They're typically on the sidelines doing stuff. But even if they aren't fighting along with you, it can be very useful to have those stat blocks handy. Especially if your game master doesn't want to control your NPCs. If you're like, hey, I want to hire some underlings to drive our wagons and haul our stuff for us, and the game master's like, man, I don't want to have to deal with all this extra stuff, then you can just, you can deal with it instead. If you really want it, your game master shouldn't have any problem with you role-playing those characters, as long as they are, being role-played appropriately, to their position and their role and that sort of thing. But personally, if I was a game master, I would want to control those characters because I wouldn't want my players doing anything that with them that I didn't approve of. That's just me personally, though. Maybe you have a little more freedom in your game, or it's a little looser, and those sort of things don't matter as much, and that's totally cool as well. But I would recommend that you have a little hired NPC thing. And for the same reasons, if you have a little NPC note card at the top of your character sheet, guess what? You're going to be thinking about that NPC a lot more. Even if they're a non-combatant, hey, you have to think about if this person is traveling with you through this dungeon this whole time. And, when you get to the end of the dungeon, you can't send him out to go, check for traps if he didn't make it with you through the rest of the way. And there was 12 encounters between there and here, so he probably isn't with you right now. But if you had this stat card on your character sheet and you were keeping track of him and you were making sure that he was in those engagements and that he was like trying to stay hidden and stay out of the fight and stay alive and that he made it that far, then yeah, I think you deserve to let that hired NPC go pick your lock for you or do whatever you need to do. That's sort of what they're there for. Okay, and I think that's all I have for Game Masters and players alike. I thank you all for sticking around this long. This video turned out to be quite a bit longer than I previously anticipated. I thought it would be done in under 20 minutes, and I think I'm probably at over half an hour now, though. I haven't checked. Anyway, that's beside the point. I digress. Next episode, I'm going to be talking to you about one of my little pet projects, one of the things I've been working on for a while, and one of the things I've been trying to figure out exactly how to explain, and that is unique encounters. I have created a set of sort of loose parameters that you can use and apply to different engagements or encounters to make them more interesting and more unique. And this is going to be very useful if you are trying to spice up combat and change it up from just the average, it's my turn, I take an attack, do I hit, I roll damage, do I miss, okay, I'll wait till next round to make an attack. You know, that can get kind of stale after a while, and so I've found a way to kind of spice things up a little bit, and I'm going to be telling you how I do that in my next my Dungeon Master Masterclass episode. Until that time, though, I thank you all for listening, and I certainly hope that I'm going to see you all very soon.